Ideas from the new poetry.
Hello, everyone, again. We are on our second edition, our second installment of Ideas from the New Poetry, hosted by John Bernys and Leonardo Marcos, where we explicate in detail the new poetry school of thought, which is simply how to connect classical poetry with artistic mediums from the future, whether that be choreography, whether that be ballet, whether that be films, whether that be plays. And our goal right now is to do a weekly installment where we talk about how to connect poetry between non-poetic forms of art. So last week we had a great time. We talked about poetry and rock music, and we talked a lot about the Velvet Underground, Lou Reed's admiration of Shakespeare. This week we're going to talk about something a little more challenging, probably the most challenging, which is how to connect poetry with physical forms of art, meaning dance, ballet, choreography, like I just said. It's most people would think that those two would be polar opposite forms of art, because I like what Victor Hugo said, that because music is very closely connected to dance, and it's like music expresses what cannot be said in words, but what also cannot remain silent. And we're mostly, what the modern population is accustomed to believe is that poetry is just words and literature, which I don't think is correct. And I also like what Ezra Pound said about it, where poetry starts to atrophy, it starts to get weak when it sways too far away from music, and music starts to atrophy, it starts to get weakened when it sways too far from dance. So they are not as distantly disconnected as people might think. And of course, before we get started, we would probably have to come to a definition of what poetry is. And it's very ambiguous. Where most people, especially in my environment and not in Europe, are accustomed to believe that poetry is just rhyming about flowers, when if there's anything poetry is not, it's rhyming about flowers. My favorite definition of what poetry is, and I would like your input on this too, Leonardo, is what Charles Olson, the American poet, said. He said that a poem is a line that connects 2 points of any point in creation. So it connects 2 points of creation together. That's what poetry is. And I tend to agree that that's probably the best definition of what poetry is. Because poetry doesn't have to be literature. I don't think it is literature. It's an energy. It's a spirit to it. So I guess before we get to the specific questions, maybe you could give us like a brief overview of the projects that you have done in your lifetime, related to dance and ballet, and how did you keep poetry in mind through all of that?
Yes, the first thing is that I completely agree with the American poet who wrote that the connection between two creation is poetry. It's completely true, because if you have a look on the past, you can see that the beginning of the poetry, in Europe, started with the Greeks, and this time Gutenberg and books didn't exist. So what they did is that they make poetry doing theaters, but the theater was a kind of lyric theater, lyric poetry, and the poetry was connected completely with the body and with the dance and with the movement of the body. That means that the poetry was done, was read, connected completely with the dance, with the movement. That's what the Greek they create, And the poetry, the lyric poetry, started like that. And you have that also in the big big shows, also what they did, on the theater, and that was really connected also with the god Dionysos, who was the god of, to do parties, to get drunk, to have fun time. And poetry started with that, but with the tragedy, because Nietzsche explained that very well, that in fact, poetry started with the tragedy, but the tragedy was connected with the dance, with the movement, and with the parties, So I think that this is really what the poetry has been the most powerful. I think more powerful even than when it is with only when you read it in a book. Of course, I love to read books. And it's, of course, very important. But I think poetry is more powerful when you get out of the books, when you start to be a little bit like it was in the past, in the antiquity. That means that it's on stage. That means that it is on parties. That means the movement of the body is completely connected with the words, with the lyrics. And then it's very, very interesting. This is why I think what I have done is not... because you asked me what I have done in that direction, but to tell you the truth, I didn't create something new, because it exists already for many centuries in the past. So what I have done is that I took back again, this way of to present the poetry, my poetry, and I did it with several things. It was with electro poetry, that's mean with music, but of course the music means that you're dancing, you're moving, so the body is completely connected with the words, with the lyrics. And also I did it with projections, for example, projections on stage, with dancers. And this feeling of, to get, these movements of words, of lyrics with the dance, in the background or in the body of the dancers, create a kind of live poem with the movement. So it was very, it was very powerful, because it was like a show. It was something very different what usually poetry is connected, because as you know, and you defended that very much, and I appreciate so much what you do, because you try to show and to explain and to give that it's possible to make a new poetry, what is very different of the things what we are used to, when it's inside a book, and you read that on the school, and after that it's over, and it can be boring, but no. Poetry is something very lively, is something what brings power, like Nietzsche explained that very well. This is how I did it, with projections, with dance, with ballet, with choreography, with on stage, and with lights, and with music, of course, electro music, or sometimes could be also classical music, why not?
Yeah. So where do you believe these two forms of art, poetry and dance, where do you feel they overlap the most?
I think they're very close. In fact, for me, you can't separate that. As you said very well, this American poet, explained that. I'm completely agree with that. I mean, it's completely in fusion. It's a fusion of words together with the body, together with the movement. In fact, is the rhythm. Because what is poetry? It's music poetry. It's a rhythm. It's a beat. It's and it's dance. So it's more music. The words are music in poetry, and the words are ballets also of the movement of the body. So this is what is for me the new poetry, and what also the anti-poetry.
So, do you believe that the human body itself contains a kind of poetry before, you put any words or intellection in the picture?
I think so. Okay, it can look strange today to say that, because of course when you write a poem, you make, you have to think, you have to, it's a work, it's not easy at all. But I think the body, and that is the theory of Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, is that the body contains the nerves, contain a kind of fire inside you, and this fire, these nerves, is more important to make poetry or to create poetry than the brain. That's why Nietzsche defended so much the idea that tragedy, what's the beginning of the poetry by the Greeks, that tragedy is directly connected with Dionysos and not with Apollon. Apollon was the perfection, the structure, was the the plastic art, but for Nietzsche, the real poetry, the real tragedy, come from the nerves. What it means that? That means that it's not only that it is the body, but that the brain have a subconscious. And this subconscious is what gives you the power of that. And I think that poetry have to be, the real poetry is like that. This doesn't mean, of course, that there is not a work. It's very difficult to write poetry. You know that. You can spend hours, days, months, years, sometimes just to write one verse. And of course, it's a real work. It's not only spontaneous. But I think the body, to answer back to what you asked me, is, of course, it's already there. For me, it's a question of nerves. Poetry is in the nerves. It's the power of the nerves, and the nerves bring the dance, bring the fact that you lose your mind even. Dionysos make that you lose your mind completely. And poetry is a kind of lose of your mind. And when you see, for example, the theories of the surrealist poets, it's exactly what they said. They said that it have to be inconscient, it have to be immediately. You don't have to think, you have to make it immediately. It's a little bit on that way that I think. But of course, I have to precise again, John, that for me, the work is very important to write well a good sentence. It's not only improvisation.
It's yeah, I totally agree with you that and I've had experience that it can take months or years to write a good poem. In fact, one of my favorite lessons that I've taken away with me in writing poetry actually came from Robert Frost, who I strongly disagree with on a lot of things around poetry. He famously said that poetry without rhyming is like a tennis court without nets. It's just not tennis. And I think that's one of the stupidest things I've ever heard, unfortunately. But one thing he said that I thought was absolutely spot on was, to start writing your first poem, you have to not be afraid to start on insufficient knowledge and he elaborated on this. It's like, of course it's important to write good poetry, to write, something that's poetry that says something, but we also need to read a lot of poetry so that we can avoid repetition, avoid repeating what's already been said. But he said that you can take that too far. If you really commit to that, you'll be 50 years old by the time you write your first poem. So poetry, I like that point that poetry is one of the mediums that most depends on courage. You have to not be afraid to start on insufficient knowledge. You have to keep in the back of your mind that this has already probably been written before. But I totally agree that poetry is an actual act of labor. It's not some spontaneous, visceral, doing it when you feel like it. It's much more laborious than that. Do you think there's anything that movement of the body can communicate, or even ideas like philosophical ideas that you don't think language can do?
Oh, yes, of course. Body is a language. You can see that when the way of a person is in front of you, the way of the person is moving his body, it already seems something. it already have a sense, it already have a language. And there is, of course, a language of the body. This is clear. This is clear. So, of course, it isn't words, because, for example, for a dancer, the movements, what they create is not words, but it's like words. Because I remember that, one of the things what really impressed me a lot from what I did was in a church. It was with my friend Jas Coleman, was playing piano. Jas Coleman is the leader of the post-punk group band Killing Joke, and he's a very good musician. He was playing piano and was a dancer, was dancing with the music and with my lights, and she was bringing very much sensuality in the connecting with the music. But this sensuality can say that it's not normal in a church, because church is mainly the soul, it's mainly the spirit, But it was very close to something with the soul and with the spirit. In fact, it's strange because it was our movement, it was sensual, but it was mystic in a way. It was mystic because mysticism is also connected with poetry, with emotions, and also with the feeling that your body is moving. And it was so emotional that when she was dancing, the dancer, and when Jas was playing piano, that there were some people who were very involved, in the feeling of what a church, what can give you, as a powerful, when they saw that, when they saw her dancing and just playing piano, some people was crying. And for me, I understood that it was something very, very, very impressive, And after that, when it was over, I just go on the altar and I read my poetry with another person, and was a guy mixing electro, and that was my poetry, and with the words. But what happens when she was dancing was my words. In fact, without words, strange enough. Of course, was in a way, when you came inside the church, when you came in, you could see that was some projections, was already in the altar was a lot of projections, and the was some girls bringing little papers where my poems they were wrote, and they offered that to everybody coming. So they came inside the temple. It was a church, but it was like a temple of the words or a church of the words of the poetry. But the moment that the dance started to be this part with the dance and with the music and the piano, and there was no words, was no lyrics. It was very emotional, and it was carrying completely my lyrics, my work. Anyway, my poetry universe,
Do you view that so yeah, obviously when you come to the measurable, I think that's a good word to use when connecting poetry and dance is what components of both of those are measurable. And then when you have poetry, you have meters, you have stanzas,
Yeah.
you have rhymes, and then
Yeah.
I would say let's connect with choreography, muscle, balance, and motion. Do you think um, for the sake of the future or for the sake of relevance between those two, do you think choreography has a lot of potential to be seen as a form of writing?
What do you understand with that? In fact, I don't understand exactly, because it's very interesting, but I'm not sure that I understood very well what you said about this future and the language of that.
Do you think it could help um, what could help diminish the bridge between poetry and dance, make it smaller? Do you think we could look at choreography as a form of writing?
As a form of? I didn't.
Writing, writing.
Writing. Okay. Yes, it is. I think so. I mean, it's exactly in the example what I gave to you, with the church. I mean, okay, it's true that when the people came in, they receive a poetry, in the paper. They saw projections in the hotel. So of course, there were already a lot of words before that the dancers start to dance. But I think yes, there is a strange connection. And of course, it looks impossible because it's invisible, But I think no, I think that there is some connection. And as I said to you, I think music and poetry is very close, like architecture too, because you need to have as you said, the rhyme, the beat, the everything is the meters. It's very precise. In fact, poetry. So, and it's the same with the ballet. It's almost the same language. This is why it started like that. I mean, with the Greeks in the antiquity.
And going back to what you said earlier about, I really like how you emphasized how poetry is an actual discipline. It's not just fun. It's not just, let's go write about this cool thing I saw. I like how you talk about poetry being a very, it can be very rigorous, very challenging to do. Even I'm sure even both of us, we both even we find it very challenging on a lot of occasions. So to be precise, how can we encourage? Okay, this is a kind of a verbose question, but how do you think we can encourage the marriage between those two without compromising the rigor, the excellence of either of those? What do you believe can be the best thing that people can do in that regard?
Ah, it's a difficult question, but I think taking pleasure, taking pleasure uh, with the fact that you can connect that a little bit with the party. I mean, if you do electro poetry, if you do rock poetry, you have the connection between both. I think, and it's the best way to start to be encouraging, for this kind of style. We talked last time about the velvet, and we also I talk about the Doors, the band, and I think that it was kind of poetry too, But the fact that it's done in a way that it's like a party, you create something, but it's more amazing, it's more easy, it's easier to to get in touch with that, and that people can have more desire. I remember, for example, that when I did electro poetry, it was in a club, in the nightclub, and repeating the same lyrics, all the time. And it was funny because I had one of my model who did it next to me, close to me, and she's Lithuanian, so was doing the same, but repeating my lyrics, but in Lithuanian. So I just completely mad because it's a very strange language, But people, when they heard the same lyrics all the time, at the end they were dancing, and they start to repeat also the lyrics. So it creates a kind of interest, but not in a way that you are, not in a boring way, but in the fact that you take pleasure.
Yep. And the last question I have on this installment, on this episode, hopefully I can say this a little more simply because it's roughly the same question. It's just a different purpose that this could serve. Because one thing that I've noticed that could be possible integrating both poetry and dance Do you think together they can make, because I hear you talking a lot about the tragedy of Dionysus and Greek and Nietzsche, and do you think merging poetry and dance can make, sort of complex philosophical, intellectual ideas more accessible to an audience if we integrate dance with it?
Yes, absolutely. It's exactly what I tried to explain. I think so. I think so because the people in the Greek time, in the Athena and in those days, um, they were not intellectuals. They were not the people like Socrates, or they were not the highest philosophers. It was everybody. Everybody was connected with that. And also, I tell you, we had in Spain Federico Garcia Lorca, who is a very famous and great poet, and people. He was so happy when he discovered sometimes in a very small village kids uh, singing his poetry. And they didn't know that it was him, they didn't know that it was a poem, but it was poetry from him that he wrote. And he said in this autobiography, he said that it happens often. That means that anybody, people were almost not in school in those days, people who are not intellectuals, they love to sing this poetry. So, and to dance with that because it has to do with flamenco. Don't forget that Lorca has been very much connected with the ballet, with the dance.
Yes.
Ah, yes. And there is also, even there is a movie about that called Bodas de Sangre in Spanish, with normally the theater, from Lorca is a story, a very tragical story, but everything is in the ballet. And I remember that I was 14 or 15 years old when I saw that. I saw that ballet, and I was very impressed about ballet, this ballet. There is not one word from Lorca. It's incredible. Huh? It's exactly what we said just before. But at the end, I had the impression really that I was reading the book from the theater from Lorca, and this Carlos Saura is a famous Spanish director, filmmaker, and he did this movie. And with this ballet, with Antonio Gades was the choreographer and the dancer. For me, was one of the best in the flamenco. Flamenco is something very popular. It have to do with party, with it's not at all. It's not
It's
like a contemporary dance, with very intellectual. No, not at all. It's for everybody, And Lorca, he worked with that, connected with flamenco, connected with the ballet, connected with the dance. And finally, there is a dancer who gave a tribute to his lyrics, to his poem, without to read one sentence of his poetry, just with the ballet.
wow. That's a great that's a great note to end off of Garcia Lorca because now that you mentioned his name, he was very closely related with the emergence of flamenco. I know he wrote quite a few poems about guitars. Yeah, I really love his quote. I still think about it, where he talks about how mystery is the only thing that keeps life exciting, and it's the only thing that makes life worthwhile is its mystery. It's only mystery. I love that. So, yeah. And so yeah, that concludes the second installment of Ideas from the New Poetry. And we will meet again next Wednesday on June 17th, and we will talk about poetry and the digital age. So poetry in connection to computers and cell phones and AI. So this has been John Bernys and Leonardo Marcos, and thank you very much for listening, and we will see you next time. Thank you.